Welcome to the fourth week of Base Bible. We are so glad to have you here with us as we approach the end of the season of Advent and are about to begin the joy of Christmas. If this is your first time here with us, please feel free to check out last week's episode. For during the season of Advent, we have been covering the short lesson that Advent is not just when we commemorate the first coming of Christ, it is the time when we anticipate the second coming of Christ. And during this season, we've been led by several amazing guides: Isaiah, the fifth evangelist, the Psalms, St. Paul the Apostle, and especially John the Baptist. But now, as we have prepared our hearts and minds, as we've prepared the way, and we have imagined what it will be like for God to arrive, we can begin to ask the question of, okay, well, where is he going to arrive? And what we also saw last week is that we might be blind to some of the ways that God is making himself present. During the past several weeks, I've dropped tantalizing hints here and there that the place that God most desires to dwell is in our innermost hearts. For while Christ, in one sense, is absent from us, ruling and reigning in heaven, and we await for his coming again in glory in the second coming. In another sense, Christ, because he has joined himself to our human nature, is present to us in many, many ways that we may not even be aware of. St. Augustine, the 4th century bishop of Hippo, who we covered in previous weeks, he writes in his biography, Confessions, an absolutely startling claim about God's presence. St. Augustine says, it is not that God ever becomes truly absent to us. It's not God who goes away. Rather, it is we who become absent to God through our lack of awareness of his presence in our lives. St. Augustine writes in his biography, Confessions, I was seeking for you outside of myself, and I failed to find the God of my heart. The God of your heart. That is the joy of Christmas. During 2020, we've been dealt a lot of awful surprises, from the coronavirus pandemic and even the loss of Kobe Bryant. Yeah, that happened this year. But hopefully we have also had a chance to rediscover ourselves, to pull ourselves back in from the world around us, and to look at our innermost soul. And my hope and prayer for you this Christmas is to discover the God of your heart, for that is where God most desires to dwell. This little vignette from the history of King David found in the second book of Samuel is actually really fitting, for it is all about how God makes himself present to us. Now, during this time of Israelite history in approximately the 10th century BCE, Israel has been out of Egypt for quite some time, and they've been ruled in little tribal villages by various folk heroes narrated in the book of Judges. And Israel, seeing themselves surrounded by all these big empires, feels weak and vulnerable, and they feel like they need to become more like the nations around them. And thus we begin to see in the Israelite history the centralization of religious and political power, and thus the rise of the Israelite monarchy as well as the temple. Now, in the midst of the trials and tribulations of Israel basically getting what they asked for and trying to become like the nations around them, we get this scene of King David living in peace and prosperity. King David is now the really good, settled king, and he feels bad about his prosperity and the lack of religious care for the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is this Israelite chest, basically, that holds a lot of important religious relics, And on top of this chest are two cherubim. Now, cherubim are not little cute babies. They're actually really terrifying angels in the ancient Near Eastern imagination. And so when David thinks about housing God, he immediately thinks of housing the Ark of the Covenant where God has been present to Israel thus far. And so David looks at the situation and says, oh, something is not right here. And we all feel this way at one point in our lives, don't we? You know, I'm at rest during quarantine while my spouse still has to work. Or it's not right that we have such prosperity while other nations are still dying in hunger and poverty. But what's wrong about David's perspective here specifically? I think we can say it's because David actually views God as some kind of impoverished victim. So God is now a victim or an equal par subject with King David, in need of David's help. Imagine that, God needing King David's help. This is just, what is this? So when God looks upon the situation, he basically just tells King David off. He basically says, it's okay, David, it's okay. I don't need or want a house. This must be something that you are struggling with. And often, when we try to take care of people, it has less to do with their need and more to do with our need to be helpful, to be good, whatever it is. It's actually our need that we fulfill by giving care to others. And that's exactly what is happening with King David here. Now, while the temple does eventually get built later by King David's son Solomon, God basically tells David, I have another plan in mind. David, I'm going to make you a house. To which King David might say, I'm already living pretty good, but thanks God, like I'm pretty cozy, like I don't need a house. What's that about? And God says, no. I'm not going to build you a physical house. I'm going to make you and your progeny after you a house. I'm going to make you as human beings a house. Now, is this God just promising the Davidic dynasty? Or is God actually saying, David, don't build me a house. You will be my house, my dwelling place. Our psalm is in some sense God giving Israel a reassuring pep talk that the promise that he made to King David in our Old Testament passage is going to be fulfilled. And the reason that Israel needs this constant reassuring pep talk is because throughout the history of Israel, the Davidic dynasty seemed to be in jeopardy. You know how in America, every 4 years there's an election and people say, this will be the most consequential election ever. And sometimes it can feel like that because it can feel like the world is going to end or that America is going to implode upon itself. And then you have to remind them the world is not going to end. The world does not revolve around you. Life will go on. Well, in a similar sort of way, God has to give Israel a reassuring pep talk that the promise that he made to King David is going to last, no matter how much it seems to be in jeopardy. One of the situations in which it seemed to be most in jeopardy was during the Babylonian exile, the situation that the prophet Isaiah had been guiding us through the past 3 weeks. For here, it's clear that Israel can't have a king if it doesn't have a kingdom. So how exactly is all that going to work? So what you find throughout the Psalms and the prophets is God having the name David constantly on his lips. And this is not so much to big up David as it is to reassure Israel that the promises that he made to David are going to be fulfilled. You remember how in the past several weeks we've been exploring a theme of the impermanence of humanity and the permanence of God. We had in Isaiah, the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. And in the Gospel of Mark, we had, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Well, in a similar way in this psalm, we get God reassuring his people. My steadfast love abides always. My hand is always going to be with David, and so on. Now, okay, reassurance is nice, and it's kind of great. But how exactly is God going to fulfill this promise? You know, it's like someone saying, don't worry, the vaccine will be developed. There will be a vaccine. Don't you worry, there will be a vaccine. And you could say, okay, that's great. I really love your reassurance. I love your attitude. And I'm sure we all want that to happen. But we're not even sure if that's going to happen. How exactly can we be sure more than just you saying so? Well, in verse 26, we get a really interesting hint as to what God plans to do in order to fulfill the promise that he made to David. We have one of King David's descendants, so one of David's progeny, one of his children, basically saying to God, you, God, are my father, my God, and the rock of my salvation. Now, those last two make sense. It makes sense for one of King David's children to say to God, you are my God and the rock of my salvation. But how does it make any sense for one of King David's descendants to call God his father? Wouldn't he call David his father or his ancestor? How is it that this future Davidic king can be a descendant of both David and also call God his father? Over the past several weeks, we have looked at many of Paul's letters which he wrote to churches that he himself founded, like the church in Corinth or the church in Thessalonica. However, when we come to the Epistle to the Romans, we are coming to a letter that Paul wrote to a community that he himself did not found. Thus, because he did not found the church in Rome, he was not their pastor, he was not a part of the community, he is addressing them as a visionary leader rather than as a pastor. Thus, when he has to address the church in Rome, he has to set the community context of what is happening in the church of Rome within a wider context of the gospel of God, which he and the other apostles are preaching throughout the Mediterranean and throughout the rest of the Roman Empire. So this is why we get a very large scope in the Epistle to the Romans. And in order to truly appreciate what it is in this passage that St. Paul is rejoicing in, we have to look at the very beginning of the Epistle to the Romans. For here is where Paul sets out his purpose in writing this letter to the church in the first place. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, the gospel concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh. Here we then see at the introduction of the Epistle to the Romans a lot of the same themes that we get toward the end. The gospel of God concerning his Son Jesus Christ, that was promised and prophesied in the Old Testament. However, he will also note that St. Paul says that Jesus was descended from David according to the flesh. Thus, that riddle that we had toward the end of our segment on the Psalm about how can the future Davidic king also call God his father, for St. Paul has been revealed in the mystery of the incarnation of Jesus Christ, who was a descendant of David according to the flesh of his mother Mary. But of his divinity, he is God's son. Thus, we have this puzzle sort of resolved where Jesus can both be a descendant of David, but also in his divinity be a child, be the son of God. But you will also notice that Paul speaks of this as a mystery that has been kept secret for many, many ages. What exactly does Paul mean by this? Well, the word mysterion in Greek often does refer to secret knowledge, a mystery, something you did not know before. This is how Jesus uses the term in the Gospel of Matthew when referring to the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. However, in Greco-Roman culture, mysterion was also a ritual by which adherents to a particular religion or sect could participate in order to take part in the joys and the treasures and the promises that their God was offering. In other words, mystery was not just secret knowledge that you acquired, it was also the means by which an adherent to a religion could participate in the divinity of their God. So when St. Paul says this mystery that was kept secret for long ages has now been revealed, yes, we have learned how it is that God was going to keep his promises to David by birthing God's own son through the flesh of the Virgin Mary to be a descendant of David. We are also invited to participate in this mystery, to take a part in the marrying of the divine and the human natures. In Eastern Orthodoxy, in the Church Fathers, mysterion becomes our word sacrament, baptism, Eucharist, and other means of participating in the life of God are the mysteries that we have now been invited to take part in, to share in the life of God. In our gospel passage, we have Luke guide us to a particular time and place. First century Palestine, a little village called Nazareth, to a young virgin girl named Mary who is engaged to Joseph, who Luke tells us is of the line of David. However, despite this initial focus on Joseph, we very quickly are moved to focus on the girl. And not only are we focusing on Mary, we are going to see the perspective of who she is from God's point of view. From God's point of view. Not a human point of view of who she is and where she's from and who she's related to, but how does God see this girl? See, when the angel addresses Mary, greetings, favored one. Favored one is a more accurate translation of the Greek than the more familiar full of grace. But we can quickly gloss over this title, Hail, favored one. It could seem, passing, but when we sit with it more and we look at the Greek and really see what it means here, it explodes with profound meaning. The Greek here is kekairito mene, which is a perfect past tense participle, meaning what we are getting here is something the equivalent of greetings, one who has previously been fully and completely graced by God. It's pretty profound. In fact, this Greek word is used in this way only in one other place, the New Testament. St. Paul the Apostle's letter to the Ephesians, in which St. Paul writes, "He destined us for adoption as his children through Jesus Christ, according to the good pleasure of his will, to the praise of his glorious grace that he freely bestowed on us in the beloved." Meaning this extraordinary thing that we learn about Mary. Mary, before becoming the mother of Christ, before she's Joseph's wife, before she's a girl, before she's a virgin, is chosen to be perfectly and completely graced by God before the foundation of the world. She is given the full measure of God's grace before she is born that we are now given in Christ. You remember that when we were talking about St. Paul in his letter to the Romans, how Paul talks about the incarnation of God as a mystery that we can participate in. Well, here is Mary fully participating in this mystery by offering herself as a dwelling place for God. In an ancient monastic prayer of the church, we read this beautiful description of who Mary is. The prayer reads, "Thou hast borne in thy womb, whom the heavens could not contain." Here then, continuing in verse 35, we see the unveiling of the great mystery of the Christian faith. The mystery that C.S. Lewis calls the grand miracle, meaning the incarnation. The angel tells Mary that the Most High will overshadow you. Now, overshadowing in the Old Testament is often used of the Ark of the Covenant. Remember when we were talking about David, and David first and foremost saw God's dwelling place as with the Ark of the Covenant. Well, now we are told here that this glory of God will overshadow Mary to bring forth Jesus Christ. We are told that the presence of God will rest over her. But wait, the mystery gets deeper even still. For we have many people, and we all fall into this trap, that think that what happens here is the divine impregnation of Mary. That essentially what we get is God saying, "Mary, I like your virgin womb. I want to put my son in there. And then once you're done with the 9 months, he'll come back out and we'll continue on with our thing." That Mary is basically an incubator for a alien humanoid that's like God named Jesus. But we have to take a closer look at what the ancient church proclaimed about the virgin birth in the Apostles' Creed, because it is so important. Mary is not being used here as an incubator for God's seed or whatever. In the Apostles' Creed, we read that Christ was born of the Virgin Mary. Notice, it is not in the Virgin Mary, but of the Virgin Mary. So important. See, Mary is offering herself as a person. She is giving her humanity to God. She's not simply offering her womb as a space for God to sort of be shoved in and then taken out. No. Mary is offering her human nature for God. And we see that the promise made to David that I'll make you a house, David, for myself, for God, that God was going to make his house out of the flesh of David. We see this now fulfilled in Mary, who offers her humanity perfectly, freely, and willingly to God. And lastly, we see in Mary how to participate in the incarnation of God. We can see how we can participate in this great mystery of the marriage of the divine and the human by offering our humanity to God and then being perfectly graced and saved by Jesus Christ, so that we may become in our humanity God's dwelling place, where God may show forth his glory both to us and to the world. Amen. Amen. This is the joy of Christmas, friends. In conclusion, to wrap up, the lesson that we've been looking at for the overall season of Advent is not just when we commemorate the first coming of Christ, it is a time when we anticipate the second coming of Christ. We have seen how to prepare ourselves, that is, our hearts and our minds, for the coming of God, how to prepare the way for him. We have seen how to imagine what it will be like when God returns. But now we are given the great mystery, how it is that God will make himself present through the incarnation. God says he will make himself a house by David and his progeny. David's progeny calls God his father. St. Paul equates Jesus Christ as both David's son and God's son. We see Mary responding to God's desire for a house by making her humanity his house, and brings about the incarnation of God's Son for David's kingdom by becoming the mother of God. Friends, thank you for being with us for the past 4 weeks of Base Bible in the season of Advent. Merry Christmas to all of you. We look forward to seeing you here again at the beginning of the season of Epiphany, in which we see how this glory of God that has been brought forth in the incarnation actually affects the world around us. Friends, we look forward to seeing you here again. Please subscribe down below if you haven't already. Please feel free to check out our previous episodes. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter. And if you haven't already, we really would appreciate your support in the creation of these videos for the teaching of the church. Please consider becoming a Patreon member for whatever tier is most reasonable for you to do at this time. And now we look forward to seeing you here again soon at Base Bible. Blessings and Merry Christmas.